This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of This Week in the Boardroom. I'm TK Kerstetter, Chairman of the NYSE Governance Services Corporate Board Member, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the show. We have a great show this week. We're going to be looking at the investor relations and the board, and who better to join us for a discussion like that than my guest, Jeff Morgan, who's the President and CEO of NIRI, the National Investor Relations Institute. Welcome, Jeff.
Thanks, TK. Great to be here.
Well, it's always a pleasure to have you, and we've got some catching up to do because you haven't been on in a little bit. So maybe a great place to start is, first of all, to talk about those challenges that you see that are current between the Investment Relation Officer, or as we affectionately call it, the IRO, and the board, and then sort of what you see sort of coming down the pike.
Sure. Well, I think we're in this cycle in our capital markets that it seems like every 5 years we have a new trend. And I think the trend right now, there's a couple different trends. The first trend is we're coming out of the recession, and for a long time, companies coming out of the recession were building up cash. They were being very conservative, and I think we've reached that point, or are in that point, where investors are saying, okay, this is no longer acceptable. You need to produce. And not to say companies weren't producing, but it's more that why are you holding cash? You need to make good business decisions. So that tide has turned, which means we need to be telling the story of where the company is going. The board needs to really understand this, and management, everybody needs to buy into this because it's a holistic conversation about the company and that things have changed. So that's sort of the first trend that we see. I think the second trend, and we've been in the middle of this, and I would say, we talk about shareholder engagement, but I'm going to call it investor empowerment, is that coming out of the recession, we gave all sorts of new credence to investors and activists. And even Mary Jo White at the SEC has said, activism used to be a dirty word. It's no longer a dirty word. It is the norm. So the fact that investors are much more loud or are voicing their concerns about a company is the norm, and we need to expect that. So we've given investors all sorts of new tools to analyze the company. Coming out of all the Dodd-Frank regulation, we've had say on pay. We're coming into an environment where we're going to have pay for performance, which is yet to be proposed, and what has been proposed is CEO pay ratios. So we continue to try to put out more information, and in fact the SEC has said we'd really like to overhaul disclosure too. So there's all that going on. So from an IR and board standpoint, we all need to be really aware that the world has changed, and we're not living 10 years ago, and I think we know that, and we're living in a new dawn that is not going to change but continue to progress. And I think we continue to try to figure out how best as companies do we deal in this new environment in bringing the investors along into the conversation in the best way possible, understanding that management still needs to run the company and boards still need to do what boards do.
Plenty of challenges for sure. And you mentioned one of the great frustrations, certainly on this show, and that is the CEO pay ratio. And I know that you guys have been vocal on this as much as we have. It's for us and for you, it's non-material, it's expensive. I think it's disruptive. To me, it's not apples to apples. So sort of give us the background for you guys.
Well, understand that as part of this change, the SEC has not really been driving their own bus for the last few years. Congress has been driving the bus. So Congress has been giving all these mandates from the Jobs Act and Dodd-Frank, and not to say they're bad things, it's just that the SEC, other than enforcement and some other things, all this new disclosure has been coming down from Congress. So the CEO pay ratio is one of them. And what it is saying is that, while all of us have gone to the SEC saying, it shouldn't be all your employees worldwide, It should just be U.S. employees. It shouldn't include seasonal employees. What the SEC has said, and I made a round to all the commissioners recently, is that they don't feel, as the commission, that they have a lot of ability to make changes to this because this is a congressional mandate. This is a law that has been passed, and they feel that law is very black and white. So what has been proposed, which all of us commented on, and we've tried to do as much as we can to educate, as have you, as has many organizations, is it very likely, in my opinion, based on what I've been told, the ultimate final approval is going to be very similar to what the proposal is. And we're not going to like it as companies because it's going to put a headline number out there that everybody is going to blow up in the press, but this is going to be the reality.
Well, it's sort of sad that we can't recognize that, certain laws that maybe were done at one time, that common sense can't take over. But we've been here before, and
understand. I think the SEC recognizes it, but I don't. It takes an act of Congress in order to make that change, and that's sort of a saying, but it's true in this case.
In this case, it's actually true. Well, IR officers and the board has had to adapt to all changes like this, and it sort of gets to my next question sort of gets to the point that you've already brought up with this shareholder engagement, or what you called
investor empowerment.
Investor empowerment. But this is, this is probably our third year that we on this show have been talking about that and the challenges of that. And each year we'd like to let it go, but we can't because it's just this growing sort of issue that if you're ignoring it, then shame on you, because it is the new way of doing business. So related to this, what are you sort of telling your membership, and then in turn, what's your membership telling you back?
What we're telling our membership is that as the IR professional, you are on the front line representing the company and being that intermediary between the company and the investors. This is your full-time job. The board has other jobs, the CEO has other jobs, the CFO has other jobs. So this is your job, is to be with investors. So number one, you need to listen to them. And so many investors want to be heard. So you need to have those conversations and be listening to what they're saying and understand what their issues are and acknowledge it. And then from an IR standpoint, you need to be that conduit to carry that information within the company. So often we jump right to an activist situation. And many activists are very willing to have a dialogue and have a conversation before it ever gets into what we consider an activism conversation. And that usually starts with IR. Hey, we don't like that you have too much cash on your balance sheet. We don't like the fact that you have a CEO that's also chairman of the board. We don't like this, we don't like that. And where I think sometimes as companies we fall down is we ignore that. And then it continues to grow. And activists now and others that have see issues, go out and talk to long-term investors. So this is not just a conversation of one, but it's the conversation of many. So IR needs to be that conduit bringing information in, and we need to be listening to those folks. And
my experience is that a great IRO can really deflect a lot of what is directed to the board. There are some cases that you just can't get around the board discussing, and the perfect example is CEO pay. The last thing you want to do as a company is parade your CEO out talking about their own pay. So this is part of the dynamic that's changing boards, because now the compensation chair better have a skill set to be able to at least communicate this. And I'll bet you there's IROs all over the country that are saying, I've got to increase the skill set of my comp chair, or what can I do? That's a long lead in to my next question, which is, when you talk to the IROs, what do they hope that boards would do that would make them more effective? And then do you also get feedback the other way around of, here's what an IRO could do that you hear from board members?
Well, and I think the answer is probably both the same, is that conduit of information. IR needs to be passing that information up to the board, and there's some times where management doesn't want boards, that they want to shelter boards, and we can't do that. And there's also times where boards are not listening, to what people are saying out there, or they'll say, oh, that'll go away, or this isn't something we have to deal with until it becomes a major situation. So I think IR can be that sentry to listening to that, but ultimately board and the C-suite have to say, okay, this is how we're going to manage this, and we're going to deal with this and have these conversations. As well as you said, when boards are out there talking, we need to equip those boards. So IR is a great conduit and a great assistance in that equipping. Whether it is speaker training, whether it is working with them and going out with IR to see how IR handles this, IR on earnings will go through all the questions that we're going to expect and give the C-suite scripts to help them prompt for an answer. We can do the same with the board, but the board has to be willing to take on that help.
Is it your sense, and hearing back from your membership, that a majority of the boards get this and that are improving in that? Or how would you sort of summarize where we're at today, knowing that we've got a ways to go?
I think boards are improving, and boy, you're really putting me on the fire here. I think boards are improving, but I think just as we all, as individuals, do we want to listen to that constructive feedback, or do we want to ignore it? And I think it's the culture of the organization and the culture within the boardroom. And some boards are very progressive and other boards are not.
Well, that answer doesn't surprise me, only because I think that's exactly where we're at, that there's some that take all this stuff very seriously, and you can identify them very quickly, because whether it's their corporate governance guidelines or their, how they handle the communication with shareholders, they are on the front end of this issue. And then there's others that have just been reluctant to change.
Yeah.
Well, another thing I wanted to ask you about is, I know that you conducted a study on this very issue, on the board shareholder engagement, and it produced for you some interesting data points. So two things, in the short time we have left, identify some of those, but also sort of say where, if directors are interested, where could they get a copy of this that might be of interest to them?
Well, let me start with the second question. NIRI does research on a regular basis. This is a new piece of research that came out in the past few months. So reach out to your IR professional. They're more than likely a member of NIRI, and we'd be happy, that the person would be happy to pull it up and pass it on to the board. Hopefully many of our members did that, because we encourage them to do that. But what it talks about, and what I think some of the surprising statistics was, it says that 60% of boards surveyed do not allow their board members to talk to investors, so 60%. But of that 40% that do allow investors to talk, 65% said they have no problem with their board talking directly to the investor community. And in fact, 35%, so we're down, of that 40%, 35% said we don't even need management present to talk to the investors. Well, I find that very surprising, and unfortunately it's not a study that we did 5 years ago, because I don't think we'd hardly see any of that 5 years ago. So I think companies are getting it, and companies are being more responsive to investors and having more conversations. I think that as well, some of the key ways that we're having those communications is obviously annual meetings, but we're seeing more one-on-one meetings, more meetings with the governance professionals, from institutional investors. So all of this, to me, is new territory, or relatively new territory. So we are going down a path where there is more communication, and companies are willing to say, we're happy to have our boards out there communicating. So I think, when you see the news stories, sometimes you think, well, nobody's doing this, but in fact, companies are doing this.
But I just can't, in today's world, particularly with Say on Pay being introduced 3 years ago, I just can't help but be surprised that 60% of the companies still aren't, quote, allowing their directors. Or do you think that maybe that is the exception and it was the best way that they can answer the question?
I think, am I surprised? No. Am I disappointed? Yeah, I am disappointed. You know, and deeper down in the study, it says that most of the conversations are generated because of some sort of activist type situation. So that is sort of the spur to make companies redevelop their board communication policies, or that's at least what I'm reading into this, and be more of a shareholder engagement friendly type of company. And it's unfortunate, and I think that's where companies need to change, that if that is the catalyst, activism is the catalyst, we're missing an opportunity here to be much more progressive, much more upfront, and create an environment where we're very willing to engage and have those conversations with investors and use the IR professional as that frontline person.
Well, I think we both offer the same advice, that it's much better to control the situation yourself, be on the front end with this, and have a good plan than it is be reacting to, again, activists coming after you. So, well, listen, great information. Appreciate you taking the time to join us again. Always good to have you as part of my team here on the show. So with that, that will conclude this week's edition of This Week in the Boardroom. We hope you enjoyed the show. We will be back again next week when we take a look at another critical topic that will help you be a better board member or committee member. So we'll see you then.
Join us again next week for This Week in the Boardroom, brought to you by NYSE Governance Services, Corporate Board Member, along with Governance Knowledge Partners, the Center for Audit Quality, and Grant Thornton, and contributing partners, National Investor Relations Institute, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.